Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Thank you for joining us on a fascinating, frustrating news night. Tonight on All In, we know where he is. At least we think we do. I'll tell you where we believe the NSA leaker Edward Snowden is holed up at this very minute and why the trouble this guy is causing the U.S. government has only just begun. Plus, President Barack Obama stood in the 93-degree heat today and delivered the speech that Al Gore called the best ever on climate given by a president. We will bring you the highlights. But we begin tonight with the truly stunning decision by the Supreme Court, where, if I may speak metaphorically, I believe John Roberts' court took out a knife and plunged it into the Voting Rights Act's soft underbelly, and then dragged the gasping, dying body across the street onto the steps of the Capitol building and left it there with a note to Congress saying it would be a shame if this law were to die. The decision in this case, Shelby County v. Holder, is one that I believe will go down in the annals of history as one of this court's absolute worst. It was an act of supreme judicial hubris and activism in which a slim 5-justice majority ruled a key provision of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional, and thus, in the short term, killed off the core of that act. Now, whether it can be revived is an open question, one we'll visit in a moment. But first, you have to understand what the court did today, because there was a lot of confusion, and there was confusion on purpose because it was complicated. It was complicated on purpose, so I want to just walk through it. Section 5 is often referred to as the heart of the Voting Rights Act. It requires what's known as pre-clearance of any changes to the way elections are run in certain parts of this country. Now, what is so brilliant about its approach, informed by history, is in the bad old days before the Voting Rights Act, some racist locality would enact some new voting rule to make it harder or impossible for black people to vote. And sure, those people could sue, but it might be a year or two before your lawsuit was even heard. And in the meantime, the election in question would have happened, and the damage would have been done. This happened all the time. This is our history. And the genius of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is that it is a preemptive, proactive means of stopping those types of discriminatory rules from being enacted without some extra scrutiny by the federal government. Now, the question becomes, which parts of the country should be subjected to this extra scrutiny, the look at every little rule that they want to change about their elections? And that's handled by a formula. It's laid out in Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which has been tweaked here and there over the years. But basically, it targets states and localities that were using special tests to restrict voting rights when the act was passed, things like literacy tests, and places where voter turnout or registration is below 50%, or was below 50% when it was last passed. And you'll see today most of the jurisdictions targeted under that formula are, well, where you'd expect them to be. The states of the old Confederacy, states with a history of racial terrorism, oppression, domination, and exploitation. It also sweeps up some localities in state you would not necessarily expect, like a couple of counties in South Dakota and California. My own home borough of Brooklyn is covered because of the way the formula works. Now, that's okay with me. These parts of the country are not allowed to just enact whatever restrictive voting rules they want. In fact, any changes to voting rules. This is what the Voting Rights Act protects us from. The United States Congress has reauthorized the Voting Rights Act 4 times, most recently in 2006 by huge bipartisan margins. But today, in a 5-4 majority decision authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, a man who has expressed skepticism toward the Voting Rights Act from the time he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, the court decided that the formula Congress passed is unconstitutional. That Congress just did it wrong. They didn't like their math. This despite the fact that the 15th Amendment, for which hundreds of thousands of Americans died, and which explicitly gives Congress the authority to enforce the right to vote, despite the plain text of that part of the Constitution. Nope, said Roberts and Alito and Thomas and Kennedy and Scalia, we don't like the way you did it. So they struck it down. And then said to Congress, if you want to keep that law you seem to like so much, then fix it in a way that we like. If that sounds ambiguous or complicated, it is ambiguous and complicated. It is by design. So let's be very clear about what that means. What the Roberts Court majority wants to do is, I think quite clearly, kill off Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance provision altogether. But they understand how politically toxic that would be. So they have come up instead with a clever way of killing it without admitting to killing it. These are people that sit just a block away from the Capitol. They look out at the House caucus. They know who this Congress is, who it represents, and what it does every day. They know how unlikely it is that this Congress will be able to save the Voting Rights Act, come up with a new formula that suits the Supreme Court. We all know how unlikely that is. And so all the people telling you today the law is not dead, they are right. But it's wounded. And before we move on to how it might be saved, which is absolutely a moral and legal imperative and can be done, let us not skip too quickly over the part where the Supreme Court tried to kill it today. Joining me now is Congressman John Conyers, Democrat from Michigan. He's also a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And Congressman, as someone who has lived this history and watched this history and knows what this act means, what is your reaction to the court's decision today?
Well, Chris, you said it so well. We've driven a dagger through the heart of the Voting Rights Act. It is one of the decisions. I thought Citizens United was about the worst decision I would ever see in these times from the Supreme Court. But this drives a dagger through it, and it gives us an enormous challenge, because everyone knows that the House is quite partisan. We're quite divided on almost everything, and it's going to take a real skill to bring people together. And the one thing that we all understand, it's got to be bipartisan.
Yes.
The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and its reauthorizations all were bipartisan. The 2006 extension of the Voter Rights Act was bipartisan. And so we've got to work with Democrats and Republicans and independents, and we have to realize that without this, there are going to be even more states enacting their own restrictive voter ID laws to make voting more difficult for so many people, the people that need them the most.
Congressman John Conyers, let me ask you this question. If you were sitting in the chambers of Chief Justice John Roberts as he was contemplating writing this decision, as he was contemplating his vote, what do you wish you could have told him?
Well, I would have told him how far we've come since the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, in which African Americans finally got the right to vote specifically. And what we're doing now will be a huge step backwards, and it's going to create a lot of work. It's going to be a huge challenge, and please let's let this voter rights case of Shelby Township be decided in a way that is fair to everybody in the nation, as they ought to do about everything.
Congressman John Conyers, Democrat from Michigan. It will be in your august body that this gets resolved, we hope. Joining me at the table now is Debo Adigbile, special counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He argued the Shelby case before the Supreme Court. And Julie Fernandez, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she oversaw the enforcement of this act, and now a senior policy analyst at the Open Society Foundation. Debo, can I begin with you? You argued this case. You read the decision.
Yes.
Why did they strike down? Can you explain to me what specifically the 5-4 majority found unconstitutional about the current formula that is used by Congress?
In a sense, the court put itself in a position that you would expect Congress and the legislature to be in. They were grappling with the progress that we've made as a nation. And what we said in our brief, and what I'll say today, is that we should not get hung up and misunderstand something fundamental. The idea that we've made progress shouldn't mean that we can't keep striving to make more progress. Somehow the court got stuck on this point, that because there has been progress in voting, we need to cease and reassess how we proceed.
Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in a remarkable dissent, an excellent dissent, said throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. hubris is a fit word for today's demolition of VRA. Julie, you worked overseeing just the day-to-day of how this act works, how preclearance worked. Did it strike you, sitting there in the Department of Justice, looking at this paperwork, that the formula that Congress had come up with then, which was essentially reauthorized, was capricious or arbitrary or ridiculous?
No, not at all, Chris. And I think that what our experience was in the department, and has been for a lot of the voting rights advocates, is that the jurisdictions that were covered by Section 5 were those jurisdictions that needed to be covered by Section 5, the history of discrimination and the current day effects. It's an important point that Justice Roberts, in his opinion, made it seem as if we were in the reauthorization only relying on what had happened a long time ago to determine which jurisdictions need to continue to have the preclearance obligations, when in fact what Congress did in 2006 was to look very carefully at recent incidents of voting discrimination, what was happening to real voters in real places. And Justice Roberts and the court just got it wrong. They haven't walked in the shoes of John Lewis. They haven't walked to see what discrimination looks like and where it looks that way.
And they just also, I mean, this is just an amazing act of of judicial activism. I mean, they had just told Congress. I mean, it's just incredible to me. The question to me, it strikes me, isn't how much progress there is or whether there's been progress. It's who gets to decide the appropriate remedy for the problem on the table. And today, the Supreme Court, Dabo, it struck me, said, we do.
And that's what's stunning. Justice Kagan put this question to our adversary during the oral argument. She said, who gets to decide? And the Constitution on this point is crystal clear. The 15th Amendment puts it with Congress to enforce the amendment against racial discrimination in voting. Congress looked at this very carefully, as Julie mentioned, and studies done at the time and since have shown that the repetitive and adaptive discrimination happens in certain places. Congress never said that voting discrimination only happens there, but what it said is that we need a special response in the places where the case-by-case method is inadequate.
A really important point, too. These distinctions are not preserved in amber. There is a way that if you feel like, oh, I'm the city of Boston and this is unfair and we're under the Voting Rights Act and actually we have a really clean record, you can get out of it, right?
Absolutely. That's the whole idea of there being a formula is not really accurate. It was really a way to identify in 65 and then in 72 when it was modified, a way to identify those jurisdictions that needed this type of remedy. But then the idea was that when they can demonstrate they don't need it anymore, they can bail out, and jurisdictions do all of the time. Not as much as maybe some would like them to, but they certainly do it. And the other point here is that right now we are back with Congress. Just to say, we're back with Congress now. The court has said, look, there is still voting discrimination. We recognize there's still voting discrimination. We think the way that Congress did this may not be the right way, but Congress, it's up to you, and that's the important part where we are now.
We have a member of Congress, a Republican, who voted for that reauthorization the last time it came up, and a current member of Congress, a Democrat, who we're going to talk to about precisely that, which is, can this get done? Dabo Adigbele from the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, Julie Fernandez from the Open Society Foundations. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, how is Congress going to take on this mess? I will ask a Democrat and a Republican if there's any hope. That's next.